She had looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand and decided she would do. Not well, not convincingly perhaps, to anyone who had known her 3 years ago, when she had been Miss Serena Vane of Ashfield Park, when her dresses had been pressed by a lady's maid, and her hair arranged before breakfast each morning without her having to ask. But well enough. The dress was plain gray wool. The cap covered most of her hair. Her hands, which had once been her mother's particular pride, were roughened now from the month she had spent in London, doing for herself what she had never once done before in her life. She picked up the traveling bag. She left the inn. The road to Ashfield Park wound through 2 miles of beech wood before opening onto the south lawn, and she had walked it 100 times as a child, had ridden it on a bay pony. Her father gave her on her 8th birthday, had driven it in the family's old barouche with her mother beside her, pointing out which trees needed trimming. She had not walked it, carrying a bag and wearing a stranger's dress. She did not let herself think about that. The housekeeper who answered the side door was a woman she did not recognize, stout, brisk, not unkind, with the manner of someone who had learned to make quick assessments of people and rarely revised them. Her name, she would later learn, was Mrs. Crail. "The agency sent you," Mrs. Crail said. "Yes, ma'am." "You've done this work before?" "I have," which was not entirely a lie. She had managed a house, she simply had not managed it from below. Mrs. Crail looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable, then stepped back. "The position is household assistant. You'll take your meals with the upper staff. Your name? Jane," she said. Plain, forgettable. Jane Somer. That was how Serena Vane came back to her own house. She had not intended to come back at all. When her cousin Aldous, and she still could not think of him without something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, had produced the document that named him heir to Ashfield Park. She had been 22 years old and 2 weeks out of mourning for her father. Her solicitor, a gentle old man named Mr. Price, who had served her family for 30 years, had looked at the paper and gone very quiet. His quietness told her everything she needed to know before he said a word. "It appears, Miss Vane, that your father executed a new will some 8 months before his death. I confess I was not informed of this. The document does appear to be in order." She had asked to see it. She had read it twice. Her father's handwriting, his signature, the correct witnesses. Everything proper, everything wrong. Aldous had been in the room. He was 3 years older than she was, and had the sort of face that arranged itself into expressions of sympathy without any sympathy behind them. He had said, "Of course you may stay, as long as you need to settle yourself." And she had known in that moment that she would not stay a single night. She had stayed at an inn. She had written letters. She had waited for the law to do something useful, and the law had done nothing at all, because the will was perfectly executed, and her father was dead, and Aldous had engaged 3 solicitors to her one. Then, 6 weeks ago, she had received a letter from Mr. Price. He had retired by then, but he still wrote to her occasionally, because he was a kind man who felt responsible, telling her that the new owner of Ashfield Park had arrived. Not Aldous. Aldous had sold it. Sold her house, her father's house, her mother's garden, the beech wood, and the south lawn, and the portrait gallery on the east corridor, sold all of it to a man named Carow. The Duke of Carow. She had not known there was a Duke of Carow. She had not, before that moment, cared particularly whether there was. She sat with the letter in her lap, in the rented room in Bath, where she had been living since her money began to run low, and she thought about the portrait of her great-grandmother in the gallery, and the roses her mother had planted the year she was married, and the window seat in the library where Serena had read every book worth reading before she was 17. Then she had written to the agency. The Duke of Carow was not what she had expected. She had assembled, in her mind, a composite figure from everything she disliked. Her cousin's smooth insincerity, A certain type of wealthy man she had met at balls, who spoke to women as though they were furniture, the particular arrogance of someone who buys a thing without knowing what it is. She had been quite ready to hate him. The first time she saw him, he was standing in the entrance hall with mud on his boots and a newspaper under his arm, and a look on his face that suggested he had been thinking about something else for several hours, and had not quite returned. He was younger than she had imagined, perhaps 30, perhaps a year or two more. Dark coat, no cravat yet. It was early, not yet 9 o'clock. He looked up when she came through with the coal scuttle, and looked at her the way people look at things that are slightly unexpected but not worth stopping for. "Mrs. Crail," he said, not to Serena but to the housekeeper who had appeared from the corridor, "these need cleaning." He held out his boots. He had taken them off in the hall, which she had not expected from a duke, and Mrs. Crail received them with the practiced ease of a woman who has been receiving muddy boots her entire professional life. Mrs. Crail passed them to Serena without a word. She stood in her own entrance hall, holding the Duke of Caro's muddy boots, and understood something that she had known abstractly for months, and had not quite felt until this moment, that he owned this floor she was standing on, this ceiling above her, the door at her back, and the stairs in front of her, and he did not know what any of it was worth, and she did, and it did not matter. She took the boots to the scullery and cleaned them. She was not going to let herself cry about boots. The house had changed and had not changed. The rooms were the same rooms. The proportions she had known her whole life. The high windows of the drawing room. The way the morning light fell across the upper landing. The particular echo of footsteps in the portrait gallery. All of that remained. But the furniture had been rearranged or replaced in places, and there were books on the library shelves she did not recognize, and the small escritoire her mother had used in the morning room had disappeared entirely, and these absences were worse than the changes. She learned the staff in pieces, the way you learn anything when you cannot ask directly. Mrs. Crail, who ran the house with quiet efficiency, and had no patience for sentiment but was not unkind. Dawson, the butler, who was older and had been with the Duke since before Caro came into the title, and who seemed to regard Ashfield Park as a place that did not yet meet his standards but might in time. Cook, who was called Mrs. Fenwick and was formidable. 2 footmen whose names she was still getting straight, and she learned the Duke. She learned him the way servants always learn their employers, from the outside, from evidence, from what he left behind and what he asked for and what he did not ask for because he simply assumed it would be there. He was not what she had expected. He ate simply. He spent most of his mornings in the library, which she was required to dust, while he was working, and he moved his papers without complaint when she came in and sometimes thanked her, which surprised her. He had a habit of standing at the window of the library and looking out at the west grounds with an expression she could not quite read, and once she came in when he was doing this and thought she saw something in it that was less like ownership and more like wondering. She told herself it did not matter what it looked like. He did not notice her, which was what she needed. She was Jane, the household assistant, young woman, plain gray dress, efficient. People see what they expect to see, and a duke in a new house expects to see staff. She had understood this and arranged herself accordingly. Then Lady Hartstone arrived. Lady Hartstone was everything Serena had been prepared to dislike. Beautiful in the particular way that announces itself, arriving with 2 carriages and a personal maid and a mother who preceded her into every room to assess it. She was perhaps 25, with pale gold hair, and a way of looking at a room that valued everything in it and found the values satisfying. She had been corresponding with the Duke's aunt, who was apparently engaged in an enthusiastic campaign to see her nephew married before the year was out. Serena learned this from Mrs. Crail, who told her in the flat tone of a woman relaying information she considers inevitable. "You'll be assigned to the guest wing for the duration of the visit. Lady Hartstone's maid does her personal things, but she'll expect the rooms kept to a particular standard." "Of course," Serena said. Lady Hartstone, Serena discovered within 24 hours, was not cruel in the large ways. She did not shout or throw things. She was cruel in the small, precise ways of a woman who has learned that a certain kind of cruelty to people in inferior positions costs her nothing. She sent things back: the tea, the arrangement of the fire, the position of her dressing table mirror, not because they were wrong, but because the sending back demonstrated something she needed to demonstrate. She spoke of the house in the third person in Serena's presence, as though the house were empty, as though she were already considering what she would change when it was hers. "The library is pleasant enough," she said to her mother one afternoon, while Serena was on her knees refastening a hem the maid had not caught. "Though I should want the shelves cleared. All those old books, nobody knows whose they are." Serena kept her eyes on the hem. Those old books were her father's. She did not say so. She finished the hem. She excused herself when she was permitted to and walked to the scullery and stood over the sink for a moment, with her hands braced against the edges of it, and when Mrs. Fenwick came in and gave her a look that asked a question, she said, "I'm quite well, thank you." And she was, or she was going to be. She had not come back to Ashfield Park to fall apart in the scullery. She had come back for a reason. She had not told herself this clearly at first. She had told herself she came back to see it, to be near it, to understand what had happened to it. These were true enough, but underneath them was something less comfortable. She had come back because she believed there was something to find. Her father had been a particular kind of man, not secretive, exactly, but private. He had kept things, letters, documents, his own version of records, in a way that was organized to his own logic and legible to very few other people. Serena had been one of those few. She had helped him with correspondence for years. She knew how he thought, and she did not believe her father had signed that will. Not the will as written. Not that version of it. There were things wrong with it. Small things, things that would mean nothing to anyone who had not known him closely. The wording in the third clause used a phrasing he would not have used. The date of execution fell on a day she had a clear memory of, a day when her father had been unwell enough that he had not risen from his bed, and she had brought him his supper herself. She had told this to Mr. Price, and he had listened carefully and said, "Miss Vane, I'm afraid that what you're describing is very difficult to prove in the absence of," and she had finished the sentence for him. In the absence of evidence, yes. She knew. The evidence, if it existed, would be here. In this house. Her father had kept copies of everything. He had kept them in a study that was now the Duke of Caro's library, in a cabinet that she had walked past every day for a week and a half without being able to get near it, because the Duke was reliably in the room from 7 in the morning until noon, and often again in the evening. She needed the room empty for an hour. What she had not expected was that the Duke would give her that hour himself. It was a Tuesday. She had come in the morning to dust, which he permitted with his usual absent courtesy, moving his papers without being asked. He had been reading something that appeared to trouble him. She had noticed that he read with his thumb pressed to the page, as though holding the words down, and when the contents were unwelcome, the pressure increased. He was pressing very hard. She was near the cabinet. She was not quite near enough. "Forgive me," he said. She turned. He was looking at her directly, which was unusual, and it startled her enough that she forgot for a moment to be Jane. "I find I want to ask you something," he said, "and I'm aware it may seem peculiar." "Your Grace?" He set the paper down. He had a way of pausing before he spoke that suggested the words were being checked against something before they were released. "How long has the family been gone from this house?" The Vanes. Do you know? She had not breathed for a moment. Some months, Your Grace, I believe. Did you know them? Any of the staff from that time? No, Your Grace. I came from London. He looked at her again in that way she had been unable to read, and then looked back at the window. I purchased this house through an agent, he said, and the transaction was, I understood it to be straightforward. Recently I've been told things that suggest it may not have been. He paused. I find I want to know more about the family who lived here. She stood with the duster in her hand and said, very carefully, I'm sorry I can't be of more help, Your Grace, he said. No, thank you, in the manner of a man dismissing something and also himself, and she understood he was going to leave the room. She had the cabinet open in 4 minutes. Her father's copies were in the third drawer, where they had always been, in the oilskin folder he had used for 30 years, and she had them in her hands, and she was reading, and her hands were not quite steady. It was there. It was all there. The copy of the original will, the real one, the one naming her. And a letter her father had written to Mr. Price that she had never seen, which had never been sent, and which named the witness Aldous had used and noted with her father's particular precision that this witness was in his employ, that the document had been presented to him under circumstances he did not feel well enough to contest. Her father had known. He had tried to write for help and had not managed to send it. She was sitting on the floor of the library with the papers in her lap when the door opened. She did not hear him come back in. She was reading, and then he was there, and there was a moment, one of those moments that are very brief and feel very long, in which they simply looked at each other, and she understood that everything she had been very careful about for 3 weeks had just become irrelevant. Miss Summer, the Duke of Carrow said, slowly. She stood. The papers were in her hand and she didn't put them down. That cabinet, he said, is locked. Yes, she said. I have the key. It was strange to say it. She had not said anything true in 3 weeks. He looked at the key, and then at her, and then at the papers, and she watched him assemble a series of questions she could see him deciding which to ask first. He chose. Who are you? She told him. She told him her name first, her real name, and she watched something move across his face that was not quite recognition. She told him about her father, and the will, and the morning she had come home from a walk to find Aldous in the study with the document, and 3 witnesses. She told him about Mr. Price and the months in Bath, and the letter that told her he had bought the house and she had understood that she had to come back. She told him about the cabinet and what her father had left in it, and she put the papers down on his desk and stepped back and let him look. He read for a long time. She waited. When he looked up, his face had done something she had not expected. It was not the face of a man challenged or defensive or caught in something inconvenient. It was the face of a man who has understood something and does not like what he has understood. Your cousin represented himself as the sole legal heir, he said. Yes. His solicitors provided documentation. And I. He stopped, pressed his thumb to the desk, which was not a paper, but the habit was the same. I should have investigated more thoroughly. She had prepared herself for this interview in the abstract many times over the past weeks. She had imagined denial or dismissal or the particular chill of a powerful man who has made a mistake and does not intend to acknowledge it. She had not quite imagined this. What do you intend to do? He said. I intend to take this to a solicitor, she said. My father's original will should be enough to open the matter. The witness Aldous used can be compelled to testify, I believe, if the right pressure is applied. And the house. She met his eyes. He had very dark eyes, and they were looking at her now in a way that was nothing like the way he had looked at her for 3 weeks, which was to say he was actually looking at her. If the original will is upheld, the house belongs to me. Yes, he said. It would. There was a pause. She thought about the portrait of her great-grandmother in the East Corridor, which she had walked past a dozen times in 3 weeks without looking directly at it, because she had not been able to afford the feeling it would cost her. "I'd like to send for my solicitor," she said. "If that's acceptable, Your Grace. Send for him today," the Duke of Caro said. "I'll make the library available, and my own men if you want them." She had not expected that either. What followed was not simple or quick. The law is rarely simple or quick, and this law least of all, because it required the unearthing of a document that a man had gone to some trouble to bury, and the compulsion of a witness who had hoped not to be compelled, and 3 separate examinations of her father's handwriting across documents spanning 20 years. Aldous engaged his solicitors again. There were letters and counter-letters, and 2 hearings that were brief and procedurally tedious and cost her a great deal of anxiety, that she distributed quietly around the back rooms of Ashfield Park, where she continued to work because she had nowhere else to go, and the Duke had told Mrs. Crail she was to stay. Lady Hartstone and her mother departed, and Serena did not witness their departure, but she heard about it from the cook, who had a gift for narrative and did not approve of people who sent back tea. The Duke's solicitor, a sharp-featured man named Mr. Allard, went over the papers in the library for 2 entire days. He came out and told the Duke things Serena could not hear, and then told her, more briefly, that the witness to Aldous' will had been found, and the circumstances of the execution were now a matter of formal inquiry. It was 6 weeks after she had opened the cabinet before the matter was settled. She was in the kitchen garden when Mr. Allard came to find her. He was not a man who showed much, but something was different in his face, a precision that had resolved the way a correction looks after it's been made. "Miss Vane," he said, "the court has upheld your father's original will. Ashfield Park is yours." She was holding a basket. She was aware that this was a slightly absurd way to receive news of this kind. She set the basket down on the path. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Allard." He nodded and went back inside. She sat down on the low stone wall at the edge of the garden and looked at the roses her mother had planted. They were going a little wild at the edges. She had noticed that for weeks she had been calculating what it would take to bring them back, and tried to feel something large enough for the occasion, and found instead that she felt very quiet. She had been fighting this since she was 22. That was 2 years, 3 months, and some days. She was allowed to be quiet for a moment. She found the Duke in the library. Of course she did. He was standing at the window in the way he had when she had thought she saw something in it that was less like ownership and more like wondering. He turned when she came in. "Mr. Allard has told me the outcome," he said. "Yes. I want you to know." He stopped in that way he had, checking the words against something. He was looking at her, not in the old way, not the way he had looked at Jane, but in the way he had been looking at her since the afternoon in this room when she had told him her name. It was a different quality of attention, and she had been aware of it for 6 weeks, in the way that you are aware of a light left on in a room you're trying not to enter. "I want you to know that I'm sorry for what you had to do to get back into your own house, for not looking more carefully at what I was purchasing, for," the pause again, "the boots, among other things." She looked at him for a moment. "You didn't know." "No," he said, "I didn't." Something in his face shifted. That's not nothing, but it's not enough either. She thought about that. It was more than she had expected, and it was said with a plainness that made it difficult to dismiss, and she had not permitted herself, in all the weeks of quiet preparation and legal wrangling, to look too carefully at the Duke of Caro for the same reason she had not looked directly at her great-grandmother's portrait, because some things cost too much if you look at them wrong. "You helped me," she said, "when it mattered. You could have made it considerably more difficult." "I could have prevented the difficulty entirely," he said. If I had done what I should have done when I bought this house. Yes, she said, you could have. It was not forgiveness. She was not quite sure what it was. It was perhaps an honest accounting, which was, she thought, a better place to start than most things. She moved back into her father's house on a Friday in October, into the rooms she had grown up in, which required some reorganization because the Duke had been using parts of them, and which smelled like her childhood, still under the smell of someone else's tenure, and which she walked through at 7 in the morning before the staff were up, alone, with her hand trailing along the walls. In the portrait gallery, she stopped in front of her great-grandmother, who looked back at her with the expression Serena had always found simultaneously comforting and demanding. A woman who had built something and fully expected it to continue. She stayed in that house. The Duke of Carrow stayed in the county. He had, it emerged, a smaller property some 4 miles east that he had purchased separately and moved to while the legal matter was resolved, which Serena had not known, and which said something about him that she was still working out the full meaning of. He called on her twice in November, formally, with correct notice, and they had tea in the drawing room and discussed the state of the grounds and the history of the East Wing, and, on the second occasion, the question of what had happened to a particular beech tree on the south edge of the property that had not been doing well. She showed him the garden on that second call, and they walked around its perimeter in the cold November light, and he asked questions about the roses with what appeared to be genuine interest, and she told him about her mother, which she had not meant to do, and he listened in the way that he listened to things, which was thoroughly. She was thinking about something else entirely, she told herself, when she looked up and found him looking at her. The third time he called, he brought Mr. Allard's final accounting of the settlement costs, which he had, without asking her, paid. She told him it was not necessary. He told her it was his view that it was. They disagreed about this for a comfortable length of time, which was, she reflected afterward, probably the most honest conversation she had yet had with anyone in 2 years. He left. She stood in the entrance hall of her house, and was aware that she was smiling. The roses would need serious attention in the spring. She had already decided she would begin with them on the first warm day. She had the garden back and the house and the portrait of her great-grandmother watching from the east corridor, and she was, for the first time in 2 years and 3 months and some days, exactly where she belonged. The fourth time he called, she had already put the kettle on.